World Affairs Council, also former president. Bill's had a very interesting career in various aspects, and he may say a little bit about that.
Sure.
But thank you, Bill, for taking on this topic this afternoon.
Well, my
Took the 6:15 a.m. ferry over from Peace Island.
Now, I used to take the 6:15 ferry in the morning, right? And I live on Peaks Island, and I did that when I was in my working years. Well, I left my working years about 5 years ago, so I'm thinking, what am I doing on the 6:15 ferry? And first of all, it was a very social ferry. Everyone talked on it and everything else because there were a few hardy souls on it, but it was also the coldest ferry imaginable for winter time because it had not had time to warm up. It would come across, 15, 20 minutes across the bay. You'd get on it, it's like, 4 degrees out. It's about 5 in the ferry. I'm thankful to have left those days behind, frankly.
Yeah.
So this morning was tough. To get on the 6:15 was a real stretch for me. But I somehow managed to survive. And we had a really interesting World Affairs Council event today with, we called the Governor's Breakfast. So we try to do that every year. And different topics come up every year. Governor Mills was there and some members of her staff. And we talked about food security, which was really interesting because you're trying to make this a world affairs. And by the way, Maine International Trade Center joined us as a partner in the event. And you're trying to make it relevant to Maine. So what is it relevant to Maine? You think, yeah, it is relevant to Maine, but then how do you stretch that out to the global arena? How do you make it relevant to the global arena? So it's very interesting. And honestly, I hadn't ever thought of food security in that context before, where we're talking about Maine food security, and then we're trying to broaden the thinking behind that out to the global arena. So it's very interesting. So I was, as Clifford mentioned, president of the World Affairs Council for a while. Now I'm still a board member. And my background is I came from my long career in the Air Force. I told my wife since I got a commission in college in the Air Force that I had a 4-year commitment, and then I spent 3 years in the reserve. I thought that was going to burn up till that commitment. Then the Air Force called me up, said, we're going to send you to Vietnam. I said, oh, wonderful. So I did go to Vietnam for a year, but that 4 years stretched into 30. And there have been trust issues ever since. But anyway, it was really, it was so interesting. We spent time, 18 years out of that 30 in Asia, Europe, Middle East. So it was really interesting. And I learned an awful lot about other people, other cultures. You're in the military, so, right, you think it's going to be all military, but it isn't. You're meeting people who are, everyday people in the countries where you're assigned. And 3 kids, so we're wandering the earth every couple of years as another assignment somewhere. It was really fascinating. And my work was in intelligence. So the odd part about it is I couldn't tell anybody what I was doing, which I thought was interesting. And but it was really fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Focused on what is the other side doing that we should know about, right? What are we trying to do to prevent threats to our country? And absolutely fascinating. So I finally left service in about 2000, retired from the Air Force. And in the meantime, what had happened was, what had kept me well employed for 20 years, really, except for a few diversions here and there, was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union decided to fold. And all of a sudden, I spent my last 10 years doing other things, like working in an embassy and doing some other types of intelligence. But also, the weird thing was, I was assigned to the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland, as the deputy head of the Office of Russia. Well, now, you can't say that outside this room, by the way, because the National Security Agency denies it has any interest in Russia. So I just want to let you know that. We had to call ourselves the Office of Reports and Analysis. We weren't allowed to say Russia. No, don't say that. Bad term. I don't know if that's been cleared finally. I don't worry about it too much anymore. I think there may be some assumption that we were interested in Russia. But we were busy closing up places left and right. And I remember one of my assignments from NSA was to come to Winter Harbor. Winter Harbor had been a really interesting intercept base, communications intercept base for the Navy For a long time, in World War II, its job was to find German submarines. That was its major function. And they had big radar, radio antennas up all over the place. And they did direction finding. So if a German sub happened to come up and send a message, right? If you pick up that message at 2 or 3 different stations at the same time, you direction find. You point your antenna, where did that come from? You plot all these directions out and you locate the submarine. And that was one of their really important missions during World War II. And then they had shifted from that, since it was a Navy base, their targets mainly were the Russian trawlers, which were intercept the vessels, basically, and also Russian submarines. But in 1990s, we were closing up, and I was offering Russian linguists, who we had thousands of, opportunities to learn Arabic. And for some reason, I don't think any of that worked out that well. I think the adventures that we had after 1990 didn't play out very well. But here we are today, in a different world, and now we've suddenly got the reemergence of Russia as a real threat, which, in the 1990s, we honestly didn't believe Russia was on its knees, really. And it was going to drift into this kind of weird capitalist criminal state, which it kind of did, but it wasn't going to be a bother force anymore, right? And China was the emerging power, right? So we're having relationships with China that are gradually going up in terms of volume and money and everything else, while Russia is fading. And now Russia is really doing, presenting a real threat to Europe and obviously to peace in Europe. So, it's funny how things come around. So here we are looking at Russia all over again. But that's interesting because of the context of this presentation, which is about economic warfare. When you have a country like Russia and it's doing stuff you don't like, one of your first things you turn to is economic warfare. And that's exactly what we've done. So what I thought I'd do today is talk about economic warfare in a kind of general sense. Just what is it? What do we do when we talk about economic warfare? Does it work? Does it not work? And then I want to close up, and I got to be careful about time because I did this already. It took me 2 hours. That was another context, right? So I don't want to keep you here all night. But I want to take it into the more specific context of Russia. So what are we doing about Russia right now in an economic, sense, and China? So we'll see if we can get there, all that, if we can get there. And I would always welcome people to ask questions as we go along. That's absolutely fine and usually helps me out because it clarifies something I've said that it maybe is confusing to everybody else, or you have interesting thoughts that contribute to the presentation. So please do that. But economic warfare is a fascinating topic, and there was a Foreign Policy Association book, there's a chapter on economic warfare, talking about economic warfare, but it's really an old story. And if you read ancient history, economic warfare goes way back. I mean, reading about the Persian Empire, I've just finished great courses. Is a really neat set of courses you can take online. You can take them online. And I just finished the Persian Empire. And the Persians are going in now, they're getting the Greeks are causing them problems, right? So the Persians are headed west toward Greece, and they are trying to bring these crazy Greek states under control. And this is really in Turkey now, it'd be Turkey, but they're all Greek states, all along the Black Sea and down the Adriatic, the Mediterranean coast, they're all Greek. So the Persians are trying to bring these Greeks under control, and the first thing they do is economic warfare. But it was really a blockade, right? That was the heart of economic warfare back in the old days. You blockade an enemy so the enemy can't get any water, food, supplies, weapons, people, and that's what you do in order to, enhance your chances of winning a conflict. So there's tons and tons of history about economic blockades. So this is not like economic warfare is anything new. It's got an old story that goes with it. There's kind of a reverse blockade, though, that people don't think about as much, which is an embargo. And here in Maine, we're very familiar with embargoes. Why? Because in 1807, Jefferson decided, we're not going to send anything to England and France because they're giving us trouble. we're gonna do an economic warfare against England and France because we don't like the way they're treating us. And England and France were, fighting, one of the long sets of wars that they were fighting. And they were intercepting American ships. So a ship bound for France could get intercepted by a British ship, the cargo taken away, the crew impressed, whatever. And so Dreyfus says, we're gonna stop that. New England didn't much like that, right? They had an embargo, but that's a reverse blockade where you're blocking your own exports to another country for political reasons. So it's part of economic warfare. It didn't go over real well in New England because we had a pretty heavy trade with England at the time, and France to some degree. And the New England states met in Hartford and decided that secession would be a good idea. It didn't work out.
What were we selling to them?
We were selling mainly agricultural products, and there was some trade in cotton at the time, but not nearly as much as there was in the mid-19th century. So and then timber. Timber was huge. Yeah, absolutely huge, because the ships depended on, we had wonderful white pine in Maine that was terrific for a mast for a ship. And the British in particular, since they had the largest navy, used up masts like crazy.
I didn't understand that.
So that's what we were doing. So we had an embargo going on that, almost caused New England states to decide they were going to leave the country. But as you know, that finally ended up in the War of 1812, and finally, 1815, we got sort of past all that. And then we instituted a very vigorous trade with England that went on for decades. In 1860, the biggest export of the United States was cotton, and it was an enormous part of our economy. Slave cotton, basically, right from the slave states. And we had an embargo then too. Who opposed it? The Confederate States of America. And they did it because they wanted English support for their rebellion. And they thought if they put some economic warfare pressure on the English would say, oh, you know what, you folks in the US Yankee land need to talk to the South, you guys need to resolve this dispute. It didn't work, but it was an embargo that the Confederate States started. So there are lots of stories about economic warfare if you go back, and they're all fascinating. So I hope this is a good topic. I think it's very interesting. But sanctions, you can think of, is really sort of the modern, I guess if I think about economic warfare today, mostly we talk about sanctions. So mostly we're not talking, well, in some cases it's really like a blockade in an awful lot of way, but sanctions tend to be smaller and more specific, and they tend to have some little thing that you're going after to change in your relationship with another country for political reasons. You're trying to pressure that country. But they really are primary measures, or primary sanctions are measures, and they can be really specific. It could be one person that you're sanctioning, right? One person. So not just a nation, but or one business, right? So there doesn't have to be a whole nation. But they're specific measures to constrain another nation, or that nation's citizens, and I would say businesses too, access to international goods and services. Those are things that are traded, right, in the international environment. Interestingly enough, secondary sanctions, which people don't think about quite as much, is when you are telling another country not to send a product that maybe you had supplied to them or you licensed for their production to a third country. So secondary sanctions are a little bit different, but they are growing in terms of the number of secondary sanctions. And right now, a good example of that is the Dutch make this machinery that makes microchip lithographs. It's a lithograph machine that etches a piece of silicon that you load on with the electronic components, right? And then you have a microchip. And the Dutch make the machines, the lithograph machines, so you can make that chip. And they make it under, it's a US designed machine, or US designed product, right? And we're telling the Dutch, you can't sell that to China. So this is recent. This just happened literally weeks ago, right? So we're telling the Dutch, yeah, you got this US licensed product, you can't provide it to China because we think it's too advanced. We don't want China to have access to these advanced microchips. I think this relationship that we're creating with China right now is going to be a really interesting story. It has lots of ramifications to it. So it's going to be, and it has ramifications for our own economy as well. Eileen? Yeah.
So we tell the Dutch not to sell to China, what's the penalty if they do?
We would probably deny them access to, it's interesting, the penalty is really interesting. You could tell the Dutch, if you do that, we will not import any longer your product that you're selling in the United States right now that may be completely unrelated to microchips. We just say, yeah, we don't like, I don't know, Dutch candy. We're going to forbid the import of Dutch candy
Tulips.
because you're selling this US designed stuff to China.
Can we just,
It's really interesting.
how do you stop the license?
Yeah, you can also revoke the license.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
which, you know, then again, you've got the issues of, okay, how do you enforce that revocation of the license? You can tell the Dutch, you cannot produce those anymore. If you're gonna do that, sell it to China.
Well, and how
Yeah.
do you police it? How do you
Usually,
enforce it?
the way you enforce it, one is the license agreement typically will tell another country where this can go as a final product. So if you're selling them a technology, a product, whatever it may be, if you're licensing that for their production, use restrictions on where that goes.
Yeah, but
and you
how
can
do you
put that in.
enforce it?
Well, you can do it through the country, you can either do it sometimes through the states, like the Netherlands. You could actually do it through the Netherlands government. So, you know, they're violating your own laws by violating a license agreement that a company has with another company in the United States.
So the oversight would be from their government or?
It could be, but that really depends on what the issue is. But you could ask another government to enforce it, or you could do what I said, which is deny them access to something they need to continue working on this thing. Or you could deny another product that they sell to you, just say, we don't want it anymore. So, yeah.
How did they respond? Or do they get to respond?
Right now, they're responding by objecting.
Ah.
Just saying, no, we want to sell this to China. This is a big product, we make a lot of money on it. We don't want you to tell us we can't provide it to China. So there's a bit of a spat going on between the United States and China on this particular issue. It's, you know, it's fascinating, this whole thing. And it gets more and more complex as you deal with these sanctions because, as I said, the sanctions get down into some really, really high levels of detail. You know, we've identified Russian oligarchs, one of my favorite sanctions. You know, a particular oligarch is sanctioned. Can't get access, he happens to have an American bank account, guess what? Can't get access to it. We don't take the money, interestingly enough. We leave the money, it's there, and if behavior changes in some way, the oligarch can get money back. Nobody's taking the money away, but they're just saying you can't get it right now. We've sanctioned that account. You can't get access to it.
Well, isn't that what happened with the yachts? They sanctioned, they
yachts are
can't sell
great.
the yachts because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a sanction, so we can hold them,
Right.
but we can't sell them and make any money. Right?
Yeah, one of my pictures in here is of a yacht.
Oh.
Yeah, it really is amazing. Current trends, this, and you all know this, right? This is why we're even teaching this sanctions thing today, because it's exploded. So if you look at, and it really happened after 9/11. So 9/11, all of a sudden there was this real interest in, okay, we've got to do something about feeding terrorist groups and groups that are anti-US, et cetera, and the office of, they have the Office of Foreign Assets Control started working on figuring out, okay, who do we need to sanction to change the behavior, and it just exploded after that. It was really amazing. We went, there were about 912 designations. A designation could be a country, a business, a bank, a person. There are all kinds of ways that designations differ. But in about 2000 or so, there were 912 designations. And I just looked up the latest number, 11,548 people, businesses, countries, whatever, entities are sanctioned by the United States right now. And can you imagine the Office of Financial Assets Control going nuts trying to figure all of this out?
How many people are in that office, do you know?
I don't know, it can't be enough. I mean, it's gotta be extremely complicated, yeah.
Forgive me for chatting again, but
Yeah.
I spent my entire career in electronic payments.
Mm,
And when they started going across country lines,
yeah,
then the Office of Foreign Assets Control started paying attention.
it
And
did,
the
indeed.
whole world, including us and the Fed and everybody else, had to change our transactions so you could put in there where it came from, where it went, where it went, so
Wow.
they could track that money.
Isn't that
So they had to
interesting?
stop stoppage.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I led the project.
Oh, yeah.
I did love that kind of stuff. It's changed all the time. Now I know nothing about it.
Oh, of course not. Well, it's interesting because when I was doing it, one of the things I did in intelligence work, of course, was we depended to make these sanctions work, we depended a lot on intelligence too, you know, surreptitious means of getting information. And you really get involved in trying to figure out, well, what is going on out there? What products, what's in that ship that's going from here to there, for example? So a lot of work goes into the intelligence side of making all this work. But I think it's really gotten to be very complex now with so many designations, and the designations are all different. And the way you make it work is, I think, the way you implement it is really complicated, and getting more so all the time. Financial restrictions are really, really important now, much more so than they used to be. We used to talk about goods, right? Physical goods. Now, largely, a lot of these designations are purely financial. So access to money, access to accounts, for example. The Treasury just issued a report on sanctions in 2021, and I actually read it, can you believe it? And I just took one piece out of it, and that is, this is what the Treasury says: it's a tool of first resort, allowing U.S. to impose material costs on adversaries. So that's the Treasury's reflecting their belief that this actually works. And that's a big question. Does it actually work? So I'm interested to hear your impressions of whether you think it does or not. I have some opinions on that. So that's current trends. It's really exploded. And why did it do that? Well, one is we still see sanctions as relatively low cost, right? Now, it's labor intensive and also information intensive, right, to make this all work. And you do have to have an issue of not only figuring out, well, what are you going to go after, then how are you going to make this work, and who are you going to be talking to, and how do you monitor it, then how do you enforce it? All those issues come up when you're trying to impose these sanctions. But it's still low cost compared to going to war, right? So you're not putting a ship out there trying to blockade a coast. You're not intercepting a product, you know, with military force. So it's looked at as a kind of halfway measure between conflict and inaction. And one of the questions when I get to the end, I have this slide that says future question mark. And it led to a question somebody was asking me this morning when I was at the other event was, well, if we don't sanction, what do we do? And that's almost where you end up. If Russia invades Ukraine and you don't sanction, well, then what else do you do? So that's a really good point. It's almost looked at as, well, you have to do something. And whether it works or not, I don't know. Sometimes it does, maybe, sometimes it doesn't. But you almost feel compelled to do something. And you don't want it to be as costly as going into a military conflict with all that entails. The international economy also opens up tremendous opportunities. Anybody who looks at globalization, if you chart globalization over time, and you take, the typical graph shows world GDP, the percent of world GDP that is results from global trade. So X percent of all the GDP generated throughout the earth now is involved in global trade, and it shoots up like a rocket after World War II. Really goes up, really, really hugely after World War II. So you've got this massive expansion of global trade, goods and money flowing throughout the international system, and that opens up opportunities for sanctions, right? You've got more targets. That's exactly what happens. And then the international finance, the dollar is dominant. The dollar opens up again opportunities, and a lot of countries don't like this, by the way. They don't particularly like the fact that we are dollar dominant, right? So it's our currency, and we can take advantage of that to impose sanctions. Other countries go, God, the French in particular. I love Macron. Anybody listen to Macron lately? Yeah. Anyway, it's fascinating. They just, yes, question. Yeah.
How long do you think the dollar will be dominant?
You know, that's a really super good question. We could have a whole class on that. But the Chinese are working very hard to establish trading relationships with other countries that don't involve the dollar.
Yeah.
So they're working very hard with the Russians right now, and they're working very hard with African countries, and to some degree with South American countries, Brazil in particular. Brazil doesn't want to get involved, by the way, in this little conflict over in Europe. And they're trying to build a trading system among these whoever participates,
their
right, that
local
doesn't involve the
currencies,
dollar, right?
Would be
that
with their
has happened?
currencies, like.
Yes, and use it, yes, in fact, they encourage other countries mostly to use as, I've never been able to pronounce this, but it's the RMB, which is the
Yeah.
Chinese currency, the renminbi.
Yes,
I'm not sure if I got that
good.
right. Eileen, you're gonna have to help me out with this one.
No.
Yes, I've never been able to pronounce that.
That's a
Say
good-
that word.
Right.
Okay,
Come
correct.
on.
So the Chinese have been trying to get other countries to
Accept it.
accept the RMB as a trading currency. That right now it's only penetrated 5% of global trade. So still 95% of global trade is conducted in dollars. And the dollar dominates in the international trading mechanisms like SWIFT, right? SWIFT is a trading, it's a transaction mechanism that exists in the world, so currencies can, sort of talk to each other, and goods can flow. And right now, the dollar is still dominant, so, yeah. Yes?
I think I read recently that Russia has gotten around some of the not being able to sell their gas to
Right.
some European countries by getting them to accept, to buy in rubles.
They have indeed, yes. Turkey, for one, is buying a lot of Russian oil and other products in rubles. Exactly.
And where would Turkey get the rubles?
That's a good question. Turkey's a strange country. Turkey has a very interesting relationship with Russia. They've had a long history of conflict, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the Black Sea area. But it's playing a sort of halfway right now between Russia and the United States on the Ukrainian issue. It's really interesting. I don't
They're
know
doing
where.
to keep your enemies closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they have to be selling stuff to Russia to get rubles. So
Oh, absolutely.
they might be selling agricultural products.
Yeah, and the Russians traveled to Turkey like crazy. They love to go to Turkey. Now, I don't know if you could, how much of a ruble account you could build up in this kind of travel, but they did love to go to Turkey. And Turkey has some exports that are valuable to the Russians, so they're, and it might be the Turks are just trading in dollars for rubles, if it's advantageous for them to do that.
And it's thrown Erdogan a lifeline.
Oh,
For
yeah.
the election, because it's staving off some of the inflation that they've experienced.
Right. So it's interesting, and so the finance. So here you go. You've got it's low. It appears to be low cost. So there's plenty of cost to it. International economy is booming, right? Big globalization and lots of opportunities for twiddling, for tweaking it in ways that you think is going to help you, right? And dollar dominance really does give us a lot of power when it comes to sanctions in really dominating not only the fact that our currency dominates, but we can dominate a lot of aspects of global trade from that. So that's why we like sanctions. We have some favorable things going on. So the impact of sanctions can be interesting. And I love Cuba as an example of this, but you can have direct impact on a population of a target country, and that is now this is, by the way, comes from another author I read. This author divided sanctions between effect and efficacy. And you can do it in a whole bunch of different ways, but this author I thought was very interesting. I'll talk about a couple of books I read. But the effect is the direct impact on the population of the target country, right? The efficacy is the outcome in terms of changed state behavior. There's a big difference. You can have a terrible effect on a country, and it has no effect on their behavior.
Like Iran.
So, and Iran is a good example. Iran, and Cuba is another one. And we've had sanctions against Cuba for 60 years now. And we haven't affected the fact it's still a single-party communist state. And it's still, it obviously was affected by a lot of things like the fall of the Soviet Union, but it still doesn't do what we want it to do, right? So we've got these sanctions. They've had a terrible effect on the Cuban population, no matter what we say about, we allow humanitarian goods and so forth. Well, no, Cuba's really been hurt. The population of Cuba has really been hurt by this. But the outcome in terms of changed state behavior is minimal. So that's the difference. Impacts of sanctions. Clifford.
Well, I just wanted to mention one, and we also mentioned that you can sanction people. But one of the more controversial forms of sanctioning people is international sports.
Ah, interesting.
And right now, I believe that the Russians are still able to compete in most international sports. But the example think of is back when there was apartheid in South Africa. We eventually prevented them from
Yeah.
competing in international sport.
Right.
And that was one of the things they were most upset about, because the South Africans love their
Oh, yeah,
international sports, and
absolutely.
they're very good at games like rugby.
Rugby especially,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know,
So
I'm
for them, that was
I'm
all.
so thoroughly opposed to that. All those athletes have trained for years
Well, that's the
and
question
years
I
and
mean.
years, and they have nothing to do with this.
I know,
Yeah.
I'm not advocating it.
I understand what you're saying, but boy, it really gets
But yeah,
my head.
you're right, absolutely.
Not fair.
And then
It
at
can
one
be done
point,
to
they
us.
were allowing
Yeah.
individuals, in individual sports to compete, right, but not the
Yeah,
teams?
and they couldn't wear like the national.
Oh,
uniform.
right.
Yeah, that's okay.
Wouldn't
as long
say
as the
they're
athletes-
controversial. Bill, can you point to an instance where sanctions have been efficacious? Where they changed the state?
Actually, yes, and I would say South Africa is one of them.
Uh-huh.
It actually had an effect. Sanctions had, there were a lot of things, other things going on, but sanctions were adopted. Really, every major economy South Africa dealt with in the West really followed sanctions pretty stringently. And it was an influencer in changing the outcome of that situation in South Africa. So I would say there are instances where they do work. And an author, I can't remember what this author said, well, a book I read anyway, said about 30% of the time they work. They actually change state behavior. And I think South Africa is an example of it. Clifford, I don't know if you would agree with that or
Yeah,
not.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
that definitely is acceptable.
Yeah, but what about another one? Think of another one like that, because South Africa had no friends.
Yeah,
They couldn't even
Right.
play the Cold War
No,
game.
they didn't.
They had no friends.
right. They didn't. The Soviet Union wasn't, they couldn't have a relationship with them even.
In fact,
So they had no one to
the
play
US
off.
was considered to be
Yeah,
the most friendly practically towards them, and England.
yeah.
But,
That was an example, I think, of some success by, sanctioning. So you can write a lot of these conditions, but these are aspects of the target typically. That could be somebody outside the target, but usually these affect whether the outcome is gonna be positive for you. So if you're trying to change state behavior, well, what are you working up against? You're working up, you think about the variables here, the size of the country. Russia's a big place, right? China's a big place. You're trying to impose sanctions on these countries, then it's tough, right? The target's internal politics and cohesion, that's really important, very, very important. Iran, we actually succeeded in our sanctions against Iran to reach a nuclear weapons agreement with them. I think we did. But we did because it wasn't as cohesive politically. Iran had a significant opposition, more or less sort of a democratic flavor to it, that actually captured control of the government in elections. They had elections, right? And that particular government, sanctions had had a huge impact on Iranian oil sales, right? So their oil sales have plummeted. They reached an agreement with the United States and others to not build nuclear weapons. So I think that was an example of success. Unfortunately, turned on its side, overthrown out by Trump later on. But I think there was an example of some success there. And it was largely due to it was due to the effectiveness of the sanctions, but it's due a lot to the internal politics in Iran as well. The target's ability to adapt internally, so that can the target work around sanctions in some way? The target's control of key traded commodities, and oil is really a significant one for Russia, right? Oil and gas. This is huge for Russia. This is a huge strength for Russia, right? You can do all you can to try to prevent their economy from growing and hurt their economy in this Ukrainian thing we're in now, but that's a really critical commodity, and that gives them a lot of strength. And the target's access to other resources and markets. So they have other places they can go. If you're denying them access to something, can they go somewhere else to get it? So those are all conditions affecting the outcome. And then here's some more. The participation, neutrality, or opposition from other countries. And the Ukrainian sanctions, Russian sanctions right now in regards to Ukraine are fascinating to me because of the different roles that different countries are playing. So you got some countries that are the United States, right? And most of Western Europe, pretty strongly in favor of these sanctions. Other countries are you know, we're not gonna take a stand on this one. And others are actively opposing sanctions by helping Russia out. So it's interesting. Yeah, that has effect on the outcome. And other nations, what do they think about, right? If they're considering whether to join in this sanctions regime, well, I think there's a huge sense of history. Poland is fascinating. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
Poland does not like Russia. They don't have a good history. And it's interesting because the Poles are have very much a sense of threat from this invasion of Ukraine right now. So they're very, very strongly in favor of what we're doing in Ukraine right now. So the history, like a country like Poland with its history, whether it'll be on the participation side, right? But and its relationship with other parties, not just the party of being sanctioned, but it could be the relationships with other countries, other Western European countries, a relationship with China. Who knows? Depends. The indifference, typically what I hear from the countries who are indifferent, they basically say it's not our fault, or the fault is on both sides. And I see this a lot in Africa. It's really interesting. So, and I was listening to a South African politician just about 2 weeks ago, and what he said was, well, this is all NATO's fault. NATO pressed up against Russia's door, and now Russia's fighting back. And so he wasn't really in favor of Russia for invading Ukraine was a great idea, but at the same time, he was basically saying it's the fault of both sides. Russia shouldn't have done that, but at the same time, the West shouldn't have been pushing Russia the way it did.
To what extent does anti-colonialism?
I think that's a factor. In particular in Africa, I think that's a huge factor. Absolutely, I think that's right. But anyway, there's a lot of these countries, only about probably less than a third of the countries in the world right now participate in sanctions against Russia. So not very many. It's a distinct minority.
It's true of South America too.
Yeah, South America as well. Brazil just will not participate in sanctions right now. So yeah. So and also, interestingly enough, I love this one. The third one, opportunism, take advantage of an economic opening. It's just really cool to watch this happen. Turkey is gaining hugely from sanctions. They got hurt by grain, right? Grain got really stopped because there's a huge grain belt between Ukraine and Russia, and most of that grain the shipment out from the Black Sea was stopped, right? Well, Turkey has been gaining enormously, even though finally the grain is shipping out, not quite at the rate it used to be, but it's now they're getting the grain back. But the other thing they're getting back is oil at cheap price. So they're buying Russian oil like crazy right now in Turkey. So there's an economic opportunity for them. And then if you happen to visit Turkey right now, there's a huge flow of stuff going through Turkey. It travels through Turkey to the Caucasus, and guess where it ends up? In Russia. And I have some pictures of it I'll show you. It's fascinating. There's an enormous increase in trade through the Caucasus to Russia and Central Asia, not just Russia, but Kazakhstan, for example, but especially the Caucasus. And Armenia, the imports to Armenia of microchips has gone up 500% for the last few months. Now, Armenia, I don't think has that big a need for microchips. So what's going on here? So there's an opportunity that some countries won't participate in sanctions because or they may say they do, but then there's an economic opportunity they want to exploit. And then there's a certain pride, right? Brazil is a great example. Brazil really wants to demonstrate its independence from the U.S. right now. And that's Lula, right? That's not Bolsonaro, that's Lula. We think Lula, oh great, Bolsonaro's gone, thank goodness, stay in Florida. But Lula is really trying to demonstrate Brazil's independence from the United States right now. And then there's another structural thing, and this is my favorite, this right France in there. I love the French. Macron is fascinating. He goes, I'll get carried away if I start talking about it. I studied France a lot in college. I wrote my master's thesis on it and so forth, but it's a fascinating country. But there is a chance here to attack U.S. dominance, right? The world structure is set up this way. United States, big superpower, too dominant. We need to bring it down a few pegs, and we need to assert the independence of these middle power countries like France, right? So that's kind of interesting. So they participate in sanctions, But McClellan's got a pretty good critique of them, actually, which is interesting.
They
And
would
he's-
love to hear you say they're a middle-powered country.
They would, yeah, I know, they would not, I would never be forgiven for that. Yeah, it was fun. I dealt with a lot of NATO officers in my career, and it was always fun to deal with the French. And I dealt with the Germans, and I'll tell you one quick story. So we have this super duper top secret, what we thought was top secret, but the Russians probably knew all that, intercept station in Berlin. So we looked way off into Eastern Germany. We could see into Poland, Hungary. We could see a lot of, and we do intercept all kinds of communications, and we also had a radar, so we could track their fighters and their aircraft. And I remember one day we were told, don't tell anybody, but the Swedes are visiting. Now this is 1986, so the Swedes were neutral, right? So the Swedish military delegation came in, and we told, I briefed them all about our mission, right? And then I was told, don't tell anybody you did this, okay? I understand. About 2 weeks later, the Finns came in, and we did the same thing. Then military officers, we briefed the Finns. And then we were told, don't tell anybody you did this, okay? We won't tell anybody. And I found it fascinating now that Sweden and Finland are applying for NATO. So yeah, we didn't tell them that they came to visit us. Super secret intel station in Berlin.
And they also combine their air force together under one control, so joint air force operation.
Interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Finland and Sweden?
Wow.
Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland,
Oh, just Air Force.
just there.
Interesting.
Good.
Probably makes sense.
Yeah. Well, my vision is when Trump's reelected to move to some Nordic country. So anyway, the benefits for the imposer, mostly the imposer is the United States. We are actively the imposer. We can, I already mentioned this, we can achieve what we think. We can achieve our objectives without the cost and risk of military conflict. And now, one of the books I read is really interesting, written by it's a French woman, I admit. Desmarais is her name, and she writes about sanctions, and it's a book called Backfire. What she's saying is sanctions don't work, and they frequently backfire against the United States. And her argument was, she picked apart these different sanctions, and in several cases, she identified U.S. economic gains as coming from these sanctions, right? And then what she's saying was our motivation was to impose, some cost on an adversary, but it was also to promote American business against, in some cases, she'll say European business. Which is very interesting. And of course, she was very suspicious of the oil and natural gas embargo sanction against Russia, because then all of a sudden, American liquefied natural gas showed up in all these European ports. And that made her very suspicious about the American economic gain.
But the thing about that is, yes, it's a gain for the U.S. businesses that take the place of who is, but for the U.S. population, for the consumer, it is not a benefit.
Oh yeah, right. Oh yeah.
Because everything costs more. Right. And also probably quality goes down as well, because the competition isn't there.
Right. Yeah. Well, she every sanction we imposed, she wanted to take apart in terms of what's the U.S. economic gain. And it was, that's a good analysis, right? It's legitimate. Definitely. And Norway right now is having a huge economic gain from liquefied natural gas, which they're now exporting to Europe, which is interesting. So anyway, that's the benefits with the imposer. The cost of the imposer can be many, right? So you gotta crank this into your calculation. There can be direct costs. When we tell we don't want Chinese solar panels anymore, right? And we did. We did it through basically a big tariff. Basically, we did a lot of damage to the solar panel industry. That's a direct cost to us, because all of a sudden our global saving enterprises that involve solar power generation are hurt because they can't get inexpensive solar panels anymore. So there's going to be a cost that we're going to pay for that.
So just on that, and people may know this, but the Chinese response in the case of solar panels is they set up factories in other East Asian countries
Yeah,
to make those solar panels. And then the question is,
right. That's
is
a
that
really
really
good
a
point.
Chinese solar
Yes.
panel, or is it
That is a
Japanese?
very good point, Clifford. It's really interesting how these products can be relabeled, right? So it may be, mostly a Chinese product, for example, but it's reassembled in Vietnam, for example, or even India to some degree, but mostly Vietnam. And they're now imported into the United States as a Vietnamese product, which we have a good trading relationship with Vietnam, right? So that's interesting. There's a potential, anytime you're doing a sanction, there's always a potential for escalation. Who knows what the response of the imposee might be, right? And if it's against a nation like Russia, well, when Russia talks about nuclear weapons, are they really serious about that? There are humanitarian consequences, right? So I think Cuba is a good example of that. I'm convinced that the poverty that still exists in Cuba today, to a large degree, is due to the U.S. sanctions that have been placed on Cuba. And it's interesting because I've watched my time here, but when I was in Germany, it was fascinating to visit East Germany. And when I would travel from Berlin through East Germany to get to West Germany, I had to go through these Soviet checkpoints. So these are not East Germans, these are Russian Soviets, right? And I would always stop at a checkpoint and get out of my car, and I'd show them my paperwork that said I could travel this way, my ID card and so forth. They photographed everything. In the background was Armed Forces Network, the American Armed Forces Network. You could hear behind, you couldn't see these officials at all. You always see a hand come out and take your papers, right? And in the background, you hear U.S. Armed Forces Network playing in the background. And I've always been convinced that if we had treated Cuba the way East Germany was treated, and East Germany, and in fact, Eastern Europe was so much exposed to Western culture, and that meant that when the wall came down, it came down really fast. I've always been convinced if we had approached Cuba differently, if we had exposed them to the positive aspects of the American culture and economy, we would have had a very different story to tell, instead of trying to embargo and isolate them. But I've diverged here somewhat. But anyway, humanitarian consequences, you can drive the target to self-sufficiency. And that is a major, that's a major factor. So and it's really interesting, when the League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy had invaded Ethiopia, or was getting ready to invade Ethiopia. The League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy. And Italy, it was really interesting. Italy managed to survive some very severe sanctions from the League of Nations, still invade Ethiopia and overrun the country, right? And then declare it some kind of Italian province, right? And they did this because they figured out ways to become self-sufficient. And they had some smart people in Italy, and they figured out ways around these sanctions, right? And there were sanctions on oil, energy supplies, there were sanctions on munitions, a whole lot of things. But the Italians figured out ways around these sanctions and basically decided to ignore them. So basically, they were pushed to self-sufficiency. The Japanese, on the other hand, if you look at the sanctions we imposed on the Japanese in 1941 in particular. So, and we had been gradually putting sanctions on Japan because of China, right? But in July 1941, we decided we're not going to ship them any more oil. That was enormous. That had an enormous impact on Japan. And it triggered, and this is a case where the Japanese couldn't go. They started looking really hard in Southeast Asia for oil, like Indonesia, for example, but they really hadn't developed any capacity to produce in Indonesia. And they were very dependent on American oil to everything, their ships, the economy, everything. And what the Japanese thought was, well, if we're not going to, and they didn't succeed in self-sufficiency or finding alternative sources, at least in time, that really drove them to think, we've got to go to war. It's the only way we're going to survive is we have to go to war. And the thought initially of the Japanese was, what we can do is, we can start working on alternative sources, on self-sufficiency, right, to protect our economy, but we can also shut the American military out of the Pacific by confining them to an area from Hawaii east, right? So we'll go in, we'll hit their fleet, they won't be able to come out anymore, and the Americans will eventually have an agreement with us to allow us to basically control China and Southeast Asia. So it was an interesting calculation. It was a decision in the summer of 1941 to go to a war with a country that was 10 times its size in terms of economic production. Really interesting decision. Motivated to a great extent by the sanctions that we imposed. So,
Go ahead.
yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that they'd also invaded Manchuria.
Oh, yeah, they certainly had.
And they
Right.
went there primarily for the coal
Yeah,
that was
right,
available.
right,
But that wasn't enough is what you're saying.
right. Wasn't enough to replace the oil. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But the Japanese, I've been fascinated for years by the Japanese decision to go to a war with a country that's vaster.
Well, they beat Russia.
They did. They decisively beat Russia. Yeah, absolutely. And they were making headway in China, although they weren't making as much as they thought they were going to. So, yes.
Another example of this is during the Napoleonic Wars, the British blockaded sugar on the continent.
They did,
And
right.
developed the whole sugar beet industry in Europe.
I know, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Right? And you know, it's really interesting how history plays a role in all this. But Hitler, when he's thinking of, well, what do we want Germany to be? And he finally decides, well, I want Hitler to be a vast European continental, well, he didn't say superpower, but power. And the way he was going to do that, one of the ways he was going to do that, he looked back in history and said, well, you know, the British fleet had done this blockade of Europe very effectively, starting in the 19th century. Whenever they wanted to blockade, they could blockade. No other fleet could challenge them, really. The other thing was he remembered World War I and the fact that the British fleet, again in World War I, had cut off basically Austria, Germany, and so forth, these states from access to food. So he's thinking, well, you know what? We can become a European power by controlling the grain production of Europe, which is basically Ukraine and the Western Soviet Union. And we can be completely self-sufficient. We won't have to worry about the British. The British can have their empire, they can have their fleet, but we'll be fine. So it is interesting how some of these calculations work out. So, but I want to mention the complexities of implementation and enforcement, and Eileen, you kind of reminded me of this, but these things get really complicated. When you have 11,548 designations, it gets really, really difficult to track what's going on and to figure out what the effect of these designations is and whether they're even fair for that matter. So there's an enormous amount of complexity that goes with trying to implement these sanctions.
Before you leave it, we want to talk about North Korea too,
Yeah.
because we've driven them to self-sufficiency.
Oh, yeah.
Although through a very autocratic government.
Right, I think that's true, absolutely true, yeah. So I'm supposed to, I got instructions to give everybody a break. Okay, you wanna just keep going?
Yeah, we don't,
No, I just hadn't heard.
we usually skip the break here.
Okay,
Don't
we're
have to
skipping the
break.
break, all right.
We don't have 2 hours.
We're skipping the break. The cost to imposer, there's another long list here, but you can have gains going to other autocratic regimes. Is Turkey autocratic? Well, to many degrees it is. And Turkey has gained actually from the sanctions by really a boost to its economy, which is interestingly enough. So that's unintentional, but that's what actually happened. And then you have obviously some resentment of US dominance and suspicion of US motivation, even among allies. And the threat to the dollar's role, right now, it hasn't gotten too strong, but it's out there. It's certainly out there. And as China grows stronger, I think that's going to be more of a factor. Longer term, there's reduced economic efficiency and economic growth. I think that's true. I think, you think about solar panels and things like that. The products we get from China because the Chinese really know how to build stuff really well, efficiently, at low cost. So if we're gonna do sanctions against China for one reason or another, we're gonna have to be prepared for some economic cost to us, right? And longer term, the international system can fracture, right? You end up with, instead of having a globalized trading system, you could have a regional trading system, for example. So whether that's, personally, I don't think that's great, but we could move in that direction. North America, and if you look at the Biden administration and the economic strategy that the Biden administration is following, it's very much a North American, which includes Mexico, United States, and Canada, focus to that economic strategy. And some participation by Western Europe, but right now a lot of Western Europe feels left out of that Biden strategy, and there are an awful lot of West European countries complaining about the U.S. national economic strategy right now. And then there's some histories. We mentioned some of these, but Libya is interesting because Libya, might go back to the 1980s, and the sanctions were effective against Libya in the sense that the government finally agreed that they'll acknowledge responsibility for the Lockerbie incident, the bombing that took place in Berlin, and other things that they were doing, and finally get out of this sanctions regime, which was hurting their oil sales. Oil sales are one of the things that are the easiest to control, by the way, so we do like oil sales. And Libya finally agreed that the Gaddafi finally said, okay, I'll do all these things that you've asked me to do. So you could say some histories there. Libya sort of complied with sanctions or the results of sanctions. But as you all know, there's not a good story. You keep following that story, it just kind of gets worse and worse. Libya's in a bit of a mess today. Cuba, huge humanitarian consequence, and I think if we look back at the 60 years of history there, sanctions have been pretty effective in the sense that they've done a lot of damage to Cuba, but they really haven't achieved the objectives that we intended when we started them. In Iraq, sanctions were effective initially when Saddam Hussein was really, truly working toward weapons of mass destruction. The sanctions slowed that whole, and the sanctions again were oil, right? Iraq's producing a lot of oil, we're saying you can't sell it anywhere. Those sanctions were fairly effective, and Saddam Hussein finally said, okay, I'll agree that, we're not gonna do these things that you want us to do, you just need to turn our access to the oil markets back on. The only problem with that was he absolutely swore that he doesn't produce weapons of mass destruction, and later we found out that was true. He doesn't. But when the final inspection teams left Iraq, and this is whatever, I'm losing track of the years now, but when they finally left Iraq, and this is 2002 probably, he has still not disclosed all the places or allowed access to all the places which the team knew could have been places for storage of, for example, chemical weapons, right? So we still hadn't seen those places. And the team left with the gaps in the information, and then later on the American intelligence filled those gaps in, saying, there are weapons of mass destruction here. Turns out there actually weren't. But Iraq, we kind of achieved our objectives there in some degree, but an awful lot of holes were left in that. And of course, Iran is another story altogether. We got Iran to agree to nuclear weapons, agreement. They said they weren't going to build nuclear weapons, right, as long as we allow them access to international markets. And then we threw that agreement out. And even though they were following it, we tossed it. And now we're back to the point where Iran has really enriched uranium to the point now where they could easily, within a year or two, build nuclear weapons. So I think that's a really unfortunate case. And another problem with Iran is the government is stronger now than it used to be. Although they're interesting, the street demonstrations that are going on right now certainly are interesting. And what impact are they going to have? But the government doesn't have the same, the Democratic opposition has been so weakened in Iran that it's hard to say that they would ever come back in a kind of, where there could be enough influence from the street against this theocratic government to make Iran change its behavior. And it's not just a theocratic government, by the way. There's an enormous military industrial complex in Iran now, which controls a huge amount of the economy and is not in favor of any kind of relaxation of Iranian government control or Iranian agreements with the West. So Iran is really, we're not making a lot of progress with now. North Korea, we're not having much success. As the latest ICBM test goes up, North Korea has access to all kinds of ways to get around sanctions. And when I was assigned to the American Embassy in Bulgaria, and I used to deal with the North Koreans, they were really interesting. They were engaged in every kind of theft imaginable. So they smuggled cigarettes, They stole everything they could get their hands on, and they assigned their diplomats abroad for years, right? They would be there for years, and they would look for every possibility to funnel money, things back to North Korea, right? And I remember trying to deal with the North Korean military attaché, because I was the US defense attaché, right, in Bulgaria. So I'm trying to deal with the North Korean attaché, and one day there's this big parade, which has nothing to do with sanctions, by the way, but there's a big military parade right below my apartment building in the center of Sofia, the capital, and I'm down at the parade with all the other attachés, right, we're saluting at the appropriate moments. You know, troops are passing by, and my wife leans out the window from the third story of the apartment building and say, hey, everybody come up. And so all the attachés go up to my apartment. Well, the attaché included the North Korean, and I had been instructed by my ambassador never have any contact with the North Korean. Well, there he is in my apartment, and I took a picture of all the attachés. In the very front row is the North Korean. And of course, my ambassador found out about that. Thank God she was a reasonable person, but she forgave me for it, but said, you know, you're really not supposed to have any contact with them. But from that day forward, that North Korean was my best friend, which is really interesting. I got to go to a social, you go to social events all the time. The North Korean tugs on my sleeve and says, I want you to meet my wife. Well, I'd been there a year, I'd never met his wife before. He introduced me to his wife. Now I want you to meet the second secretary at the embassy. So I met the second secretary. And then we opened up this whole great channel of communication, which of course I had to go to the CIA station chief, right, and tell, hey, guess what, the North Korean wants to talk to me. And the station chief said, oh, good. Well, just tell me everything he says. And by the way, you might want to tell him this. So it was really interesting. But they really did have a fascinating enterprise for smuggling in the Balkans. And it wasn't just the fact they were in Bulgaria, they were doing the whole Balkans area was being stripped of various products.
Were these the individual? They were making money on the side, the diplomats, or was it?
Most of that money, most of the money, products, whatever it might be, were going back to North Korea. And they were probably getting some kind of a payoff in all this as well. So, yeah.
There's two economies in North Korea. There's the official government economy and the armed forces economy.
Yeah.
And they trade on their own to bring in money.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
As long as North Koreans have access to China and Soviet Union or Russia, the sanctions simply will not work.
Right, right.
Just
Just one,
almost, no, just to say, like, it's a second, but untouchable.
Untouchable.
Right.
It's totally controlled by the military. Yeah. And if Kim Jong, the deal leader, doesn't have firm control of the military, which he does for the moment, but they operate in their own world.
does one dwarf the other?
Yeah.
I think North Korean official economy is dwarfed by the military.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah,
It's the only one with hard currency.
I'm sorry?
It's the only one with hard currency.
Hard currency,
Yeah.
and they operate on border towns like Dalian and other Chinese areas, and they control the people coming in and out of China, as well as the goods that are traveling in and out of China and Russia through Vladivostok and other areas.
Right.
So sanctions just simply not working.
Right.
Bill, would the North Korean guy, would he meet you alone?
What?
He would meet you alone, just him and you?
No, it was always with somebody else. Like if we were
Yeah.
meeting, it was somebody else from the embassy was there
Yeah.
as well. Right. It would be the second secretary.
That sounded really, really funny to me.
Right. And, you know, he always, and of course, but he was, you know, as I said, for the next year, my best friend, and he kept saying, why do we dislike each other so much, you know? We should be friends. So, but in the meantime, they're smuggling cigarettes, drugs, they're making tons of money for North Korea, all kinds of enterprises throughout the Balkans. It wasn't just Bulgaria, because the Balkans.
What year?
This was late 90s.
Okay, so after.
Yeah.
And I guess it's cyber stuff now.
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised,
Very
absolutely, totally, yep.
Do you
So-
have any, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna ask, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Respect.
I'm a little bit familiar with Mexico and how the Mexican military is starting to run all kinds
right.
of businesses, and I'm wondering, is that underground or is it above ground so far, do
It's
you know?
quite open.
Yeah,
Everybody in that region knows.
they've got a piece of the
Yeah,
airport and trains.
Yeah, they have their own economy, their own bank
Right.
account.
Yeah,
their,
absolutely.
I mean, it's
Right.
it's kind of strange because it's bigger economy than the actual economy. So who's controlling who is,
Right.
is
And you see a lot of that in Iran today.
Yeah.
So the Iranian security forces really have an enormous economic role in Iran. You normally don't think of that. You don't think of your military as running a big economic enterprise. But when I was in Turkey in the 1970s, the same thing was true. The Turkish armed forces had an enormous economic enterprise, which included hospitals, stores, and included all kinds of products that they had control of. They were like a monopoly control, and they had a huge construction empire that worked not only in Turkey but all over the Middle East, but all controlled by the military. So the military was like another economy for Turkey.
yeah, there's a huge human export from North Korea.
Yeah.
Building stadiums in the Middle East, all sorts of, I mean, all the money, they don't pay the people directly, the money goes to the government, Korean government.
Yeah.
If you can imagine that.
Yeah. So other just histories, to consider about Venezuela now and whether we've succeeded or not, we really haven't made a whole lot of progress in Venezuela in a whole lot of areas. Although we have talked to Venezuela recently about loosening up the oil embargo, oil restrictions that we have on Venezuela right now. But again, you've got a country that's, still floundering along, really basically a hellhole as far as any kind of reasonable government is concerned, and 2 million Venezuelans living next door in Colombia right now, plus a large immigration population coming to the United States. The Soviet Union Eastern Bloc is a different story, and that is interesting because we had a very tight control over products that could be brought into the Soviet Union for 30, 40 years, really controlled what could be sold. And the Soviet Union spent a lot of time in Eastern Bloc countries, the Czechoslovakia and East Germany and so forth, a lot of times trying to get access to Western products, which they were being denied. And the sanctions were relatively effective because they were pretty strongly enforced and pretty strongly agreed with. And I think I think they contributed to the sort of technological backwardness of the Soviet Union, which I think really was a key factor in bringing down the Soviet Union. But I think most of the sort of disintegration of the Soviet Union was driven internally. Just the fact that they had an economy that just didn't have a way to function effectively compared to the Western economies. So, but there was some success to sanctions at the time. So Russia, if you look at Russia, and I'll just run through Russia and China quickly here. If you look at Russia right now, here's an independent or an energy-dependent economy. Technologically, it still hasn't caught up to the West in a whole lot of areas, and it's economically growing, but not at a fast pace by any means. So it's a bit sluggish, but it's a big country. It's a gigantic country with a lot of military power still today. A very, very tight government control, because you all hear the stories now about people going to prison for 25 years for expressing any opposition to the government whatsoever. And if you're opposed to anything the government's doing, you either have to leave the country, or you have to expect a jail sentence, or you can, drop out of a 12th floor of an apartment building. So it's just, Clifford.
Yeah, one of the things we have to wonder about is the brain drain
Oh yeah, absolutely.
from Russia.
Right.
In the long run, that's got to.
I do too. I think that's certainly a point. Russia has a good, it reminds me of Italy in some ways, and how Italy adapted to sanctions. Russia has a really good central bank management. So the central bank folks who were pretty smart knew how to control the inflation that resulted from the war and the sanctions and so forth. And they kept they've really done a good job of managing the Russian economy from the standpoint of keeping jobs going, providing funds where funds are needed because of maybe there's been an area of the economy that's been especially hard hit. And also controlling inflation, keeping inflation down to a reasonable level. So inflation, there's about a 20% loss in the ruble to the dollar, so it's not a huge decline in the ruble's value. And and they estimate about a 2% decline in the Russian GDP. So nothing major going on, and a lot of that's driven by the central bank. Yes.
This article says that for all the heavy sanctions we put on Russia, it's been about a third successful. I think it was a third, something like that. I mean, it's just, everything you said that makes it difficult, Russia had.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and the central bank has done a good job of managing it. They have some very good technical people who know how to handle economic situations when they arise. So they've done well under the circumstances.
Why didn't we shut off all their banks from Western?
You know, I don't know. Why haven't we shut them off completely? I don't know. Because they still have some access to SWIFT, right? We haven't shut them off completely.
And that Hungarian bank, that was.
Right. I don't know. The sanctions have lots of holes in them still. They really do. So, but I don't know. I'm not sure why that isn't happening. But anyway, obviously Russia has key traded commodities, which include fossil fuels, which is their number one. Half of their exterior support for the economy comes from fossil fuel sales abroad. Minerals, grains, they have a good bit of external support still. If countries support Russia and aren't willing to participate in the sanctions, India being one of the major ones, right? And then there's sanctions holes, which you just mentioned. So Western companies continue to do business with or in Russia. Quite a bit of business still going on by Western companies. And there's still Russian continued access to the international currency exchange system. So it hasn't been shut off all the way.
Do you think that, I don't know about the Western companies' continued business, I don't know how we can stop that. But I wonder if the SWIFT situation is, let's not shoot all of our bullets. I'm sorry I said that, I hate guns. But we need to keep something in reserve and marshal them out. I don't know the answer to that at all.
Oh, you mean have sanctions, keep some of them for the next time they do something really bad?
Yeah, we can't be out of options.
Well, I would suspect the Western companies said, no, you can't, don't shut these banks out.
Oh, I know. So there's some pressure there. And of course, a lot of Western companies were in there, even here in Maine, IDEX and WEX were still involved. And they had trouble figuring out, okay, what do we do? Can we just sort of lay low and not do anything? And then eventually decide they're going to discontinue their operations in Russia. But it took a while for that to happen.
And we wanted, Lukoil is a Russian.
What's that? Lukoil is a Russian company.
We wanted the grain deal to go through.
Oh, yeah.
So we had to dangle some things out in front of them. I think that we also wanted to give time for some of the Western companies to slowly move money around. And the other thing that I've read several times about why we're lenient on banks when they launder money is because we gain more intelligence from watching it.
Interesting.
And we don't want to shut that down. Because it helps us figure out a lot of other things.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Russia outcomes, no behavioral change, really, right? They haven't decided that this was a bad idea. It really was a bad idea, but they haven't seemed to have made that leap yet. Higher energy and food prices worldwide, it helped the Russian treasury, oddly enough. Isn't that interesting? So you could strain their access to, say, providing oil, fossil fuels, right? And you cut off sales, but all of a sudden, when you do that, the world price of oil goes up, right? You saw it here in the United States. And when the price goes up, they can sell less oil and make more money. Isn't that interesting? So they're doing quite well as far as income from fossil fuel sales is concerned.
I mean, it's apparent that the Saudi prince is shaking hands with Putin.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And India is very happy to buy Russian oil. China is happy to buy Russian oil. Saudi Arabia doesn't need oil, but still. So higher energy and food prices worldwide, again, they push up prices and you make money off of less sales, actually. Immigration, Clifford, you mentioned, mostly young people have left the country. A lot of people have left. 800,000 I read at one point. I don't know if that number is actually accurate. but they have fled to Central Asia and to the Baltic states largely. And it's quite an exodus. And also quite a few of them in Turkey and the Caucasus. And then there's been, interestingly enough, no severe energy crisis in Western Europe, good weather, relatively. And more independence from Russian fuels has been the result of this. And over time, you see this transition going on in Western Europe, where I think the outcome of all this, you know, if we look back, if it's 10 years later, we're going to see that they are less dependent on Russian oil. And I think that's true. I think that's actually going to result from this. And then there's reduced access to microchips. It's harder for them to get microchips than it was before. Some manufacturing components and materials that they use to build things like the wings of aircraft, for example. There's been a marginal effect on the Russian economy that I mentioned to you already. Putin's leadership reinforced, and I left a big question mark about that. You'd think, wow, he's a war general, war leader, whatever it may be. Is it reinforced or not? I don't know. It seems like in a lot of ways it is, but in other ways it seems it's weakened. So
control is so tight that it's very hard to tell.
It is hard to tell. But was it last week I'm reading Prigozhin. You know, Prigozhin is a nasty fellow who runs the Wagner Group.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Alexei Prigozhin.
Yeah.
And he's saying some really bad things about Putin. I'm thinking, wow, how does he get away with this? And Putin's, you know, the whole team of leadership in Russia right now. So I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. So is it leadership reinforced or not? Closer Russian-Chinese alignment, I think that's true. And the danger of escalation is always out here in this kind of, well, this is military, right? This is forces fighting each other. And what do you do when Putin says he's moving nuclear missiles into Belarus? Is he going to do that? What are the consequences of doing that? So
he already had them in a little enclave between Poland and
Kaliningrad.
Oh, is that right?
Kaliningrad.
Kaliningrad? Yeah.
I was gonna say, on the other side, I think you could say this has caused a dramatic shift in German.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my
foreign
God,
policy.
yes. Oh, yeah.
And that also has long-term consequences.
Oh, it's true. And there's a really good, by Schultz, there's a really good piece called the Zeitenwende. He's talking about the change, right? So we reach a point where we have to change, and it's really an interesting piece. It's in Foreign Affairs magazine, and very interesting. You know, Germany is changing. Foreign policy is changing. Where you get critical supplies that the country needs. How do you manage your relationships with other countries?
And that might change soon too, the conservative powers.
Yeah, absolutely. So Germany has, you know, and a lot of the European countries when I was in Western Europe, a lot of the NATO allies would say, well, what's the United States doing? Everything we did over there, somebody would run to me and say, what's the United States doing? I think there's been some realization now that they have to pick up more of the responsibility. And that means some military, you know, increase the military spending, worry more about how do we do a mutual defense, what are mutual defense arrangements? Why are we so dependent on the United States for everything?
Is some of that post-Trump presidency? I mean, fear of if we go back to that they have to become more independent?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's an interesting time for Europe. And the Zeitenwende is a really interesting paper. It's about Germany is changing its foreign policy fundamentally. And so we'll see. Danger of escalation, I think we mentioned already. So China, this is really different. This is an economic war. It's really, and I find it fascinating that we are unable to figure out how to accommodate the rise of China. And how do we blend the American and Chinese economies in ways that actually work and lead to peace and not war? And so you've got a sanction. I think it's odd. There's a sanctions regime in place against China now, but we're not at war with China. We're not. China, yeah, is doing some bad things like the suppression of the Uyghur population. We don't think that's really a great idea. The claiming of the South China Sea is kind of their lake, right? So there are sanctions that are being imposed, but they're really coming almost more from an economic perspective than a military one, which is interesting. So you've got this economic competition going on, but it's overlain with security concerns and a changed U.S. national economic policy. So we've changed our economic, Biden has really changed two things. One, he's adopted a new national security strategy. And the second thing he's adopted is a new US national economic strategy. He likes the symmetry of the terminology there, right?
But you mean bringing more manufacturing back,
Exactly.
becoming independent
Exactly.
in terms of?
If you look at the economic strategy, you see made in America over and over again throughout that strategy. And why? Because we've handed off the manufacturing to China. So we still have a lot of, we've still got a lot of technological processes going on. We've still got a lot of mental work in the United States that goes on that's, top of the world class. But we've handed off processing and manufacturing to other countries. And that's
Like the Dutch.
the Dutch, exactly. The lithography machines, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Bill, I'd like to just bring up one thing which actually impacts Maine, which is that we've dramatically reduced the number of Chinese students
Oh, yeah,
in the United States,
absolutely.
including in Maine. And, we could have a discussion about, if we had time, do we think in the long term that's a good thing or not?
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the ways that you can build, we talk about citizen diplomacy, right, in the World Affairs Council. And, this impact, which is not easy to measure, but of this kind of people-to-people connection.
Yeah, to me, it's negative. It's really negative that we're doing that.
It really is. I mean, Germany, US students can get their graduate degree in Germany. And not only, they did a study, and average student will stay 5.7 years after the graduation.
Wow.
And they bring in business from overseas.
Oh, yeah.
To that effect, the German government is actually giving stipend to students to go to school there. And they really look deeply into this process. So I agree with you. I think it's the changing of the Chinese, and they in turn become ambassadors from us back to China. So
I think that's costly to both sides in the long run. I really do.
Especially the universities.
Yeah.
Because they pay full.
So would the aspect of China requiring companies to transfer their technologies, is that a reverse type of sanction? Because don't they require some companies to not, show their technology? So in a sense, that's a reverse aspect of a sanction.
It is, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons.
Inverse.
Yeah, and so if you read Catherine Tai, actually participated in writing to a great extent in the National Economic Strategy. She's our trade representative right now. But she's made some interesting statements, and one of the complaints she makes about China is technological theft. So when you bring an American product in and you want Chinese manufacturing or whatever you're looking for, they want access to the blueprints. and why not? Well, by the way, in my closet, I have an old house on Peaks Island, and one of the closets is lined with newspaper. And a little piece of the newspaper fell off, and it was from a British newspaper in 1874. It was an article bitterly complaining about the American technological theft. And the Americans were going over to Britain and stealing all of the leading world technology that was developed in Britain and bringing it back to the United States to compete with Britain. It's a fascinating little piece, right? 1874. And I said, well, this is really cool. And
steam engines, railroads.
Yeah, and by the way, I found the 1869 tax bill in the house. It's a nice old, Greek revival home on a hill in Peaks Island, and $9.18 in 1869 paid to the city of Portland with a 5% discount if I paid by May the 10th. And interestingly enough, $3 was poll tax. So they had a capitation tax at the time. Every head of household had to pay a poll tax. So there's a $3 poll tax that went along with that. $9.18.
Give it to the main store.
It's gone up about 100-fold. But anyway, it's fascinating because we were doing that, right? We were going over to Britain, and if you look at our industrial history, we were bringing back British design to Lowell and Lawrence and places like that, where we built these massive mills that eventually outcompeted the British. So
So
are
mainly
the-
weaving with fabric.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
massive fabric production, for
Yeah.
example, textile production, yeah.
But
That's more
what
of an
country doesn't
accommodation.
do that?
What country doesn't do it?
Yeah, that's,
Well,
you know.
So, and China does it well, so, yeah, there's a problem, but,
Yeah.
you know, and one of the things we're trying to do with these sanctions against China is to prevent that or discourage it, so, yeah, they do it.
I can tell you two little anecdotes, maybe. Well, one is an anecdote, you know, GE sells jet engines. And
Right,
when questioned about the fact that China was stealing the technology, GE's position was that it was such a big market that they couldn't afford not to sell their jet engines there.
yeah,
The other anecdote is, my son works for a company that makes the same kind of, or utilizes the devices that the Dutch are making. And they export these machines to
yeah,
Taiwan and to Japan and to China and all over the place. And one of his big complaints was that they would come back to him and say, and the machines are very capital intensive, so you want to keep them running all the time. And if they're not running all the time, or they're spoiling the silicon discs, people get very upset because, and they would come and complain to him that, you know, this machine's not working right. So he would go over there, that's his job, is go over there and put out the fire. And he would find that they had bought some copy of a component from the Chinese and installed it in his machine, and that's the reason the machine didn't work properly.
wow.
And so he would tell them, sorry guys, you know, we'll be happy to sell you a good one. You buy the junky ones, you got a problem.
It is true, there are all kinds of things that are going on in that relationship that we think are negative to us, right? Theft of technology, the fact that we have to have a Chinese partner. If you go in and start a business in China, you have to have a Chinese partner and so forth. And Catherine Tai writes over and over again about how they aren't following the rules. It's a rules-based order. And of course, my question, I hate to be so cynical, but I do ask, who writes the rules and who enforces them? So the Chinese are not following the rules-based order. I thought that's interesting. So there you go, vulnerabilities, you know, it's dependent on the global economy. China really is dependent on global trade, right? Their internal market is growing, but it's still heavily dependent on global economy. Exporting, dollar exchange system, they have a high dependence on it. They're at the technological mid-level, not at the top level. So and they need energy imports. And then if I look at their strengths though, it's a lot, right? So their economic dynamism is really a huge one. And really interesting, manufacturing process knowledge is crucial in understanding China today. They manufacture so much. When you build something, you learn much more than about building that something. You learn a whole lot of things that could be taken elsewhere, right? So I remember when I was learning languages, so I would go from learning one language to another. Learning one language gave me all kinds of techniques to learn another. I didn't know that, but it did. You learn a whole lot about structure and grammar and things like that. And when you get into the next language, you can apply all that you learn to it, right? To learning the next language. The next language is easier. That's what I discovered. And I think manufacturing process knowledge is very similar. So you become the expert on Apple, you build a whole ecosystem around Apple, right? Apple products and so forth. That knowledge in that product and that ecosystem, that manufacturing that you've done can be taken elsewhere and applied to other products. So I think that's really important as a strength of China right now.
Hey, Bill, I mean, I'm involved in China a lot about apparel, footwear, outdoor manufacturing, and they're building factories in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and other parts of Asian neighboring countries, and they're not exporting the contract, but they own those factories outside, and they're manufacturing it out there, so they cannot be sanctioned.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. It's Vietnam. It's not Chinese. Strengths more. technological capabilities are growing. They have key traded commodities, manufacturers by the ton, right? Minerals, pharmaceuticals, solar panels, batteries, et cetera, et cetera. They have a huge internal market, which is growing because of the wealth of the Chinese consumer now, right? And German companies are deeply embedded into that market. And then they have a global economic role, which is absolutely critical to so much of our world economy now. And then outcomes, well, I don't know. But there are immediate impacts on the US economy when we try to separate ourselves from China because we're really dependent on their products. Lots of really good stuff produced efficiently and cheaply. The changing US relationship with allies, maybe not everyone is going to agree with us in the implementation of measures we're taking that are not in China's favor. Do you incentivize the Belt and Road? Does that drive China to go to Brazil, to go to Kenya, to go elsewhere, looking for where do they keep their economic power growing if the West, the United States mainly, is deciding to step back a little bit, right? China-Russian alignment, I think that's an issue. There's always, and again, this feeds into the dangers of escalation, which are out there with the Taiwanese issue, with the issue of the South Pacific, freedom of navigation, and things like that. So there it is. What's the future? And again, sanctions are, I think, you do something when you feel like you need to do something, right? You do sanctions. And Ukraine's invaded, you almost have to do something. Whether they work or not, there are a whole lot of variables that decide whether they do or not. And there's never really a good, clean answer to all this. And you have to look at all the variables. And by the way, sanctioned countries are almost always somewhat smarter than you expect, right? They figure out ways to get around them.
It's a smarter, clever.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is an ad from the back page of My Nation magazine. And interestingly enough, please help us send vital medical supplies to Cuba now. So donate to this organization. Why? Because we have sanctions against Cuba. Well, medical supplies. Yes, well, that's not completely true. Look at the bottom paragraph. Global Health Partners has a U.S. Commerce Department license to send these medical supplies to Cuba.
Yeah.
So you can make a donation to them because we have a license from the Department of Commerce to do this.
You know, this is also a play on partners,
Yeah.
partners in health.
Right,
Which
right.
is a very good nonprofit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Legitimate. So I'm
Absolutely.
reading this thinking.
Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah.
That's a little scary.
Yeah, Global Health Partners. Anyway, there you go, Cuba, right? Now, there are some other pictures for you, and I'm finishing up, by the way, so yep, we're almost done. That is Iranian, and Iranians have become really expert at building drones and missile systems, right? That's an Iranian system on the left. That is a North Korean ICBM, just pictured from the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. So sanctions, are they working? I don't know, sometimes. I love these two. That is a truck park in Georgia.
Yeah.
That is, and this is the line of trucks going through to Russia.
This
is from about a month ago.
Anybody tracking Central Asian countries? From what I hear from my friends from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, there's like significant increase of US products.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
What products?
US products.
US going through Central Asia.
Oh,
Right,
interesting.
yeah, right.
Like you
Oh,
said,
yeah.
who tracks it?
Are we
Who's
filtering
tracking
it?
Yeah, does anybody?
Yeah.
I imagine there's all kinds of tracking going on, yeah, and we know there are lots of holes in all this, and there's a big one right
Yeah.
there. And those are stuff, that's mainly a pipeline that's going from Turkey, through Turkey to the Caucasus, and then through Georgia up into Russia. So that's the pipeline. And we talked to the Turks about this, and they're saying, oh, certainly we'll take action. I don't know, we'll see. And that is a Russian yacht in the United Arab Emirates there on the left, that nice big boat. And then on the right is a Russian frigate in South Africa. And the South Africans had just had exercises with the Russian and Chinese navies. The South Africans did. And then that is a that's actually from a unmanned aerial vehicle, one of these big drones, right? and that is the control components, the microchips and the control components. And a Ukrainian soldier holding those, wondering, where did these come from? How did they get there? I thought we'd shut these off. No, they're, you know, again, Armenia, you know, 500% increase in microchip imports. So sanctions are a tough one, they really are. So that oh, wait a minute, I got another picture. Oh, yeah, it's one of my favorites. This is, yeah, again.
President of India.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then finally, Germany deeply embedded, those cars there, Volkswagen, huge plants. There are like 30 or 40 plants in Germany that are from Germany that are in China right now building cars. One of their biggest market, even bigger than in Germany, in Europe, in fact, is China. That's a huge market. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah.
Volkswagen is #1 in China. If
Yeah.
you ask the Chinese people,
And they have been for a long time.
long time.
Yeah.
But it took them a long time to do it.
Yes.
They had a lot of problems in the first 10 years of trying to get in there.
Yeah, so anyway, there's, you know, again, it's hard to say, no, Germany, you can't do this, right? No, and that is an Apple plant, it's a Foxconn plant producing Apple iPhones in China as well. Again,
I love
Yeah.
how on all their packaging,
what's that?
I love how on all their packaging it says designed in California.
Right, design in
Oh, and then
California,
it's
yeah, exactly,
Small
yeah,
print,
right, yeah,
manufactured in China.
yeah. Further
Well,
reading,
we're about out of
yeah.
time.
Yes, we are out of time. Further reading, really good books. I don't know if you really want to read about sanctions, it's not that exciting. But anyway, Deborah Ray wrote a really good one about the backfire, which is really, when you do sanctions, you better be ready, you're going to pay a price for it. And she wrote a good book, How Sanctions Reshape the World Against U.S. Interests. And so your sanctions can backfire on you, even though they sometimes work, right? 30%, let's say. And then Nicholas Mulder wrote a really good study of the sanctions regime imposed by the various countries in the League of Nations from the end of World War I to the beginning of World War II. It's an interesting study about sanctions and how they work or don't work. So if you're interested, there are a couple of really interesting books about sanctions.
So Bill, we'd like to thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great discussion. So, speaking of Iran, which we have mentioned today, we will be talking in depth about Iran, led by Kathleen Sutherland, this time, or 3 o'clock, be here, 3 o'clock next Tuesday, to talk about Iran.
Well, she teaches a course that I take every Tuesday that goes from 12:45 to 2:45, 12:30 to 2:45, that's why I'm late. So she's asked our